I had a supervisor in a clinical pastoral education year that I did in New Orleans who came from just above Lafayette. Though he himself was not a Cajun, he loved Cajun people. And he loved Cajun stories, and he had this wonderful facility of when things would really get tense, as they sometimes did in this kind of very careful work, he could almost always break the tension with some wonderful Cajun story, and I wish I had his ability to imitate, because the Cajuns are folk from Nova Scotia who came down to this part of Louisiana right after Louisiana Purchase, and they still reflect some of their old ways of talking and some of the new ways. But anyway, I remember one time when a student was really being unwise in how much of himself he was revealing, and he was trying to teach us how to have a proper respect for boundaries. He said to this lady, "You remind me of Pierre and Boudreaux, two Cajuns who spent one Saturday night drinking together in a pub, and finally Pierre decides it's time for him to go home, and he's had a good bit to drink, and he takes a shortcut through the cemetery and doesn't realize that a grave had been dug for use the next day, and he falls right into it and can't get out, and he's tried a while, so he finally just gives up, and he's lying down in the corner, and he's just whimpering, "I'm cold, I'm cold, I'm cold." Well, Boudreaux came along a little later. He hadn't had as much to drink, so he saw the grave and managed not to fall into it. But as he's making his way around it, he hears this voice down in the darkness saying, "I'm cold, I'm cold, I'm cold." He says, "Of course you're cold. You done kicked off all your dirt." Began to try to fill it up on him. And my friend said, "Now you got to be careful in kicking off all your dirt in public." Another time we had a student who was way too intrusive in the questions that he asked, and I hope this is not going to offend anybody when I'm about to tell it. It's a wonderful story, I think. And again, it broke the tension. He was saying you just can't press too hard, ask too many questions. And he said there was once Pierre and Marie married to each other and had two beautiful, beautiful children. And Pierre was so proud of them. Then they had a third child that was so ugly it was just absolutely embarrassing. And Pierre, being a kind of vain fellow, was really uncomfortable about this. And so he began to make some very subtle hints to Marie about this, and she was indignant that he would even raise questions of that sort. But Marie gets very sick. Doctor says she may be about to die. And Pierre still got this issue bothering him. So he goes in and says, "Marie, they tell me you're very sick. You may be about to go right into the presence of God and Virgin Mary." And he said, "I have just got to know the truth. Is that ugly duckling mine?" She said, "Perry, you're right. I am so sick, and I may be about to die, and I may be going into the presence of the Virgin Mary. I have got to tell you the truth. That ugly duckling is yours, but them first two are A-bears." And then he said, "That's one question too many." You know, that's when I wish I hadn't asked. And so maybe I'll come back with some good Cajun stories. I know I'll come back with a good story of our family being together. So your family here, we're family there. Blessed be God who can be here with you, there with us, and everywhere at work for good. Let's invoke the good presence of that one into our presence. Holy Father, we thank you for all of life and its splendor and wonder, the many experiences of giving up and getting, of receiving new life, of letting young life move on into greater and greater maturity. We name the whole process in all of its light and darkness a good gift that can be used for growth. Would you help us now tonight to be open to ways that truth out of the past can become blessing in the present? May our heritage be resource and hope to us this night. We ask through Christ our Lord. Amen. The theme that I've chosen for this 6-week study from now to the 15th of May are some of the pivotal figures in our Old Testament heritage known as the prophets. As I suggested last Wednesday night, there was a period of decline as far as Israel's political life was concerned. You remember I said that it was under David and Solomon that the sons and daughters of Abraham reached the pinnacle of their political prominence. For one shining moment, this little bridge of land between Egypt and Mesopotamia, Israel was the dominant political force. But then after Solomon, they began to decline politically. They divided again into north and south. They were largely simply pawns between the two greater forces of Egypt and Assyria and the forces that were on the north and the south. And it's interesting that religiously, in the worst of times, often the best of insights are born. I try to tell people the church lives in inverse relationship to the times. When times are prosperous and good, people have a tendency to ignore the matters of faith. It's when life gets tough and when events tumble in on us that oftentimes we take the trouble to look at issues and we struggle with life more realistically. And so in this time of decline, there appeared a remarkable group of individuals known as prophets. As you hear that word, you probably think of individuals who are able to foretell the future, of people who are able to predict what's going to happen way out there ahead. And there's a certain truth to that, but the real fact is that prophets are folk who see deeply into the present and therefore sense the direction that history is moving. So their foresight is often the product of their insight. They look deeply into the shape of the present. They see more in it than most of us see, and therefore they're able to suggest what is likely to come of this set of circumstances. And so I want us to look in this period at 6 of the significant prophetic figures that were a part of Israel's life from, say, about 950 BC, when Solomon ended his reign, until 586 BC, when the last vestige of the sons and daughters of Abraham having any political control over Palestine was ended. In 586, Jerusalem was overwhelmed by the forces of Babylon, and most of the best people were taken into captivity. And from 586 BC until 1948, in the memory of many of us in this room, the Hebrews had no political control of that land that had been promised them. In 1948, when the modern state of Israel was founded, it's the first time for almost 2,500 years that Jewish people had had political control of that particular part of the world. Now, in this period from 950 to 586, as the declining fortunes politically of the children of Israel were taking place, you had these people who looked deeply into what was happening and helped interpret how this mystery of God does work in history. And we can learn a great deal about our own relationship to God and how to live out our own lives if we will look carefully and listen to these very profound and very, very insightful interpreters. And tonight I would like to talk to you about one of the most famous of these prophets, who is a man named Amos. Amos lived about the middle of the 8th century BC, and I think he did his most remarkable work between 750 and 740, sometime, because we don't have precise instruments here, sometime in the middle of the 8th century. Now, one of the significances of Amos is not just what he said, but he was the first of the prophets whose oracles got written down. You realize that most of our human history has relied on oral communication. The writing down of what people say is a relatively recent phenomenon. And whereas there had been other prophetic figures in the history of Israel, the prophet Nathan was very significant with King David. Elijah we talked about last week. But whatever it was they said simply got kind of put into a general description. Amos is the first person whose specific teachings were put down in writing and were made available to later generations. Now we don't know whether Amos himself wrote these things down or whether somebody who heard Amos and was so impressed by him put these into the more permanent form of writing. But the truth is, this represents the first of the writing prophets, the first person who, after the actual event itself, had what was done written down, and so it had influence on subsequent generations. Now, it's interesting, when he initially said these words to the people of Israel, they made no appreciable impact. In fact, the city of Bethel, where he utters these oracles, seems to be not in any way altered by the things that he said. But 25 years later, when the things that he saw happening and what they pretended did occur, and he was vindicated by the events of history, and they were in such great anguish to try to figure out what was happening, somebody remembered that Amos had said those words, and they said, maybe we better go back. Maybe he knew something that we didn't realize at the time. And so, vindicated by subsequent events, they went back and either found what he had written or what somebody else remembered of his having said. And that's how this particular book came into existence. And it's very, very perceptive in terms of its analysis of the human situation. He was the first, then, of the prophets to have his words have a life beyond the actual saying of them. Let me tell you a little bit about Amos the man. I've told you roughly where he's positioned in his history in the middle of the 8th century B.C. He was not from one of the schools of the professional prophets. He did not belong to one of the circles of learning that existed in that day. He was not a member of one of the prominent families that had emerged as Israel's life had developed. The truth is, he was a rustic peasant. He was a shepherd and a farmer by primary vocation. He made his home in a little village called Tekoa, which is south of Bethlehem and toward the Dead Sea. It's in a very desert region that is utterly sparse, and he would very carefully take some sheep and would try to nurture them as best he could. He also would raise some sycamore plants on trees, sycamore fruit on trees. And then periodically this rustic shepherd would take what he had raised to the urban areas like Jerusalem or Bethel or Samaria further to the north, and there he would sell his products. So his life was centered in that emptiness and sparseness of the desert. But he would periodically make forays into the urban areas, the more sophisticated forms of civilization. He had no credentials that would commend him as being a person of insight. And that's important to realize, that he simply kind of appeared out of nowhere. And much like we talked about Elijah last week, he appeared out of nowhere and said things that turned out, in retrospect, to be profoundly insightful. There were two things about Amos, however, that did equip him for the work that he was about to do. The first was that he had keen eyes to observe the tiniest detail of what he saw. And that's one of the ways the desert could condition a person who lived there. There is so little to see in the desert. There is so little that changes, there's so little that's moving or growing, that you could either be lulled to sleep and therefore have almost oblivious unconsciousness, or you could become so accentuated by the scarcity of images that you would notice things that the average person would not even pay any attention to. Do you remember Moses, after he had been 40 years as a shepherd in the desert, was keen enough in his observance to see one bush that was burning and wasn't being consumed, and it was such an unusual phenomenon that he pulls aside to see what's happening. Well, Amos has that same kind of perceptive quality. The desert could be a great school for vigilance. And so he was a keen observer, and if you read his book, it's not very long, you'll notice that his eye for detail is exquisite. The other thing about Amos that equipped him for his task was that he had lived in virtual isolation, and therefore the covenant that Yahweh had made with the children of Israel at Sinai was still his main point of reference. Now remember that when the children of Israel came out of Egypt and were 40 years in the wilderness and then crossed over into the Promised Land, they encountered a very old and primitive kind of paganism. It was called the worship of Baal, or the gods of fertility, or the gods that had caused the rains to be under their control. And I talked last week about how different it is to believe that whatever it is in heaven is either indifferent or hostile to you, and therefore you have to figure out a way to curry the favor of heaven. That's what's back of all the sacrifices and all the elaborate rituals that pagan religion adopted. They honestly felt that they had to do something to try to get the attention of the gods and maybe make them disposed to treat humans kindly. So, operating on the premise that whatever is in heaven is either against us hostilely or indifferent to us, and our job is to somehow send sweet-smelling savors to curry their favor. That kind of religion, premised on divine indifference, is radically different from what broke into Abraham, a God who called himself Yahweh and absolutely took Abraham's breath away by saying, I want to bless you. It is my nature to want to give you blessing. It is not my nature to be indifferent or hostile, and therefore you have to give me things. That took a long time. For people who had been steeped in this pagan presupposition, it took a long time to make that primal shift to a deity that could be counted on to love because of what that God was, not because of what you earned. But of course, this was the beginning of the inbreak of this tradition of blessing that is the essence of biblical faith, that it is God's nature to want to give blessing. He is not against us. He is for us profoundly. And of course, the covenant that was given to the children of Israel at Sinai, if you look at it carefully, the Ten Commandments, there is nothing ritualistic about that covenant. Everything about that covenant has to do with relationships. It is as if God is saying, I want to bless you, and here's how I put creation together so that it will work for your blessing. If you'll stop and think about it, if every human being on this planet lived by the Ten Commandments completely, that is, if we related properly to God, if we related properly to ourselves as His beloved children, and then if we related to each other in terms of the Ten Commandments, we would not only be fully functioning adults ourselves, but our community would be a humane one. There would be no killing, there would be no stealing, there would be no adultery, there would be no lying. We would live together in ways that would enhance the humanness of us all. Now, the expression of this God who wants to bless is in a series of laws which are not put there to say, you do these and earn the divine blessing. Those laws are themselves the expression of the divine blessing. Here's how you use your freedom in ways that makes you fully free and functioning and makes the society around you healthy. And so it is this Sinai religion of relationship that came clashing with the Baal religion of ritual and trying to earn God's favor. That was the religious challenge that the children of Israel faced. Now, Amos had lived largely in that area right where the children of Israel had first entered Palestine. He had had very little contact with the religion of Baal. But the other sons and daughters of Abraham who had moved into the cities and who had had much more interaction with Baal worship, they had become greatly influenced by that way of viewing reality, and their religion had gotten very mixed up. Their religion had gotten very, very contaminated, In fact, if you'll think about last week, I said that Elijah sensed that they were trying to do life on the basis of two radically different religious visions, and it just simply does not work and does not support. So he had an uncontaminated religious vision if you take what happened at the Mount of Sinai to be your point of reference. So as he would periodically make his way to these urban centers and see what his brothers and sisters had come to as they had become contaminated by primitive paganism, his sharp eye of the desert, with this as his moral point of reference, made him very, very aware that the way they were putting life together had absolutely no future to it. And so one day at one of their high feasts, it would be like our 4th of July, just envision thousands of Israelites coming together and assembling in one place and going through one of these very great pageants of ritual that had more paganism in it really than the religion of Yahweh. More an attempt to curry God's favor than to express the way that God's blessing wanted to come out. Imagine thousands of them gathered for this great religious pageant, and suddenly this rustic shepherd stands up in their midst and says, "Doom is about to fall on this culture. There is absolutely no future the way that you're putting life together. And the day of the Lord is coming quickly, and it's going to be a day of terrible destruction. This culture is going to collapse like a house of cards, and there's going to be hardly anything left of it. There is going to be hell to pay when the fruits of what you're doing with life come to their maturity." Now, what was it that Amos, with his desert eyes, saw about contemporary Israelite culture that made him so negative? Well, the thing that just jumped out at him, the thing he could hardly believe given his heritage from Sinai, was that the people in the cities had lost all positive concern for each other. They had lost that sense of family, that sense that we're in this together, and what happens to any of us has an effect on all of us. He could not believe the indifference with which the brothers and sisters that had their same origin in Abraham, and how indifferent they were to each other, and how totally competitive and totally destructive that culture had become. The most glaring example of this was that there was a huge gap between the few people that had become very rich and the many people who had become very poor. It was astonishing to Amos, as he came out of that simple life of the desert, to see some people having not one home but two homes, one for the summer and one for the winter. He saw a few of these rich people lounging on couches of ivory that had inlaid gold. He saw them drinking wine not just by the glassful but by the bowlful, just taking it with both hands and almost washing it over themselves. And he noticed that the rich women were so indulgent that they had gotten as fat as he calls the cows of Bashan, which are really very, very big and obese animals. He was seeing what the few who were rich were doing with the affluence that they had acquired. At the same time, most of the people did not even have enough money to eat. They didn't have any place to live. The system of slavery was being reintroduced into Israel's life, and Amos couldn't believe it. Slavery was what they had been delivered from out of Egypt. They knew what it was to be slaves, and God had set them free from that. And to think that they would put some of their own kinspeople back into slavery was just a sign of this incredible indifference to each other, unawareness of any kind of fellow feeling or any kind of camaraderie that goes with a good family. The first thing he saw was that they had lost all sense of their commonality. They no longer realize that what happened to somebody else did make a difference to them. It would be like two people being in a boat, and one person says, "I've sprung a leak up here," and the other one said, "Well, it doesn't matter to me because I'm on this end of the boat." In other words, not realizing that there is a kind of corporate interrelatedness, so that it cannot be good for anyone unless it is also good for everyone. And if it is bad for anyone, then that becomes, or should become, a common concern. Now, in every good family system, that's the way it works. We have this sense that we're in it together, and therefore what is happening to any part of the family is something that needs to matter to me. I've told you before, but I find it to be an absolutely archetypal story. It comes out of the writings of Thomas Hardy, 19th century Scottish life. It seems that a tenant farmer gets sick and dies and leaves a widow and 3 children. She has no family. And so the day after the funeral, she goes to the owner of this big estate and says, "Can you let me take my husband's place in the field, or can you let me go to work as a domestic in the great manor house? I have these 3 children, and I have to have some way of supporting them." And the man who lived in the manor house says, "I'm really sorry for you, but your problem is really no concern to me. I've got to have a man to work in your husband's place. I've got to have his house. You and your children have got to be out by day after tomorrow." And so sure enough, on that morning, gathering up what little she owned, which she could carry easily in a simple knapsack, she and the 3 little children go out the road of the manor. They had no more reason for turning right than left, because she had no one in this world to whom she could look for help. She goes to the nearest town and proceeds to go house by house and tell her story. "My husband has just died. I've got 3 little children I'm responsible for. I'm willing to do any kind of work. Please, will you give me something to do so I can be responsible for my family?" And everybody said the same thing as the lord of the manor. "I'm really sorry, but your problems have nothing to do with me." And so door after door is slammed in her face. Her children have to sleep on the ground at night. They have nothing to eat. All they can drink is from the town well. Well, not surprisingly, on the 5th day of this kind of neglect, the youngest child, emaciated and weak now by hunger, wakes up with a burning fever. By 10 o'clock, the 2nd child is burning with fever. By noon, the 3rd child. By 2 in the afternoon, the widowed mother. They had all become infected with diphtheria because of their weakened condition, and every house where they had sought help also got engulfed. The whole community became involved in an epidemic, and only then did it dawn on them that what was happening to that simple family did have an impact on their well-being. The phrase, "what happens to you makes a difference to me," is first of all simply a statement of fact, and if it is embraced, then it becomes a way of deciding how to act. And that is what Amos saw was absolutely missing in the cities of Samaria and Bethel. Nobody seemed to care about what happened to anybody else. And he saw that the net impact of that kind of indifference and that kind of competitive hostility was that the rich people, concerned only to indulge themselves and pamper themselves, were getting weaker and weaker and flabbier and flabbier. And the poor people were being so neglected and so exploited that they were getting bitterer and bitterer. And what Amos saw had to come as a consequence was that if there was any external threat to that particular society, the people who had reason to defend it did not have the strength, because the rich had become flabby, and the people who had the strength had no reason to defend it, because they had been so disenfranchised that they had no stake whatsoever in maintaining the kingdom. Louis Lomax said back in the 1960s, the most dangerous person in the world is the one who has nothing to lose. The person who has been so left out that he or she has no stake, no ownership, is not only not going to defend this system, but if threat comes, they're probably going to join in the destruction. Well, the great host of the citizens in Amos's time had nothing to lose because they had been systematically excluded, and Amos saw that that kind of society had no future. I think you can just mark it down that there's something deep in our human nature that hungers for a kind of justice, a kind of fairness, a kind of equivalency. I tell couples who are getting ready to be married that you've got to find some way to share life on some kind of equitable terms, because if one person always gets his or her way and the other person never does, it's like the tires on your car getting out of balance. That kind of inequity is a disease that is going to infect everybody that is involved. And I think that you can just look back over history, and the reason that society after society has crumbled and not been able to withstand when some strong adversary comes from outside is that injustice weakens the fabric of not only each person but of the corporate society, and therefore it does things to them that make them incapable of being able to defend themselves in the future. John Woolman was a 18th century Quaker who came to this country from England. He was a tailor in Mount Holly, New Jersey, and a good 100 years before the Civil War, he began to say that slavery was going to be the end of this country if it wasn't faced in some way. And the interesting thing about Woolman's insight was that he didn't just dwell on the fact that making a person a slave is dehumanizing that one and turning that one into a piece of property, which of course is true. He realized that slavery diminished the humanness of the slave owner, because it meant that they became dependent on the labors of other people. They lost their capacity for self-sufficiency. They ceased to know how to do anything for themselves because they were owning and forcing all these other people to do all of the vital work. And that kind of arrangement simply doesn't have a future to it. First time I read that, it really came home very, very existentially, because some of the stories that have lived in my family system, my mother being from North Mississippi, eloquently prove that particular insight. My great-grandfather Barry owned a 3,000-acre plantation in northern Mississippi, had a magnificent antebellum home, had any number of slaves in the 1840s and 1850s. The story is that my grandmother had one slave girl who did nothing but help her dress and comb her hair and do the kinds of things that a young lady of that culture would have done. Well, when the Civil War came and the slaves were freed and most of them left, this great-great-grandfather of mine, who knew how to entertain grandly and knew how to dress up and ride around wonderfully on his horse, he did not know the first thing about how to manage this vast estate where he himself had to do some of the work. And he lost the plantation because he couldn't even make enough money to pay the taxes. Now, I imagine many of you have heard stories out of your family heritage that are similar to that. And it reminds me that when we have too great a sense of injustice, too great a gap, it doesn't portend well for anybody's future. And so the first thing that he saw was that their rampant lack of concern for each other, and this saying, "I'll get mine and forget what happens to anybody else," is a lethal attitude that portends bad things for any culture. The other thing that Amos saw about that culture was that religion, though it was active and vibrant, had turned into an utterly futile kind of exercise and had almost nothing to do with living life in more wholesome and more healthy ways. They had relapsed into this notion that religion is going through a lot of motions and trying to curry the favors of the gods by sending up all kinds of sweet savoring offerings. And so they had these elaborate rituals that had no ethical carryover whatsoever. They would go through all the proper ceremonies But nothing that was done in the temple made people more loving, more sensitive to each other, more anxious to relate to God, and more willing to give love to their fellow human beings. And that's why he could stand up on that high feast day and have God say, I don't like your solemn assemblies. I am sick of your sacrifices and all of these rituals that you're going through. Let justice roll down like the mountains, and let a sense of fairness and compassion for each other be the effect of your religion. You see, if you go back to Sinai, God says, I don't need anything from you. God didn't create us because he had to have us. God didn't create us because he was forced to. Out of the bounty of God's desire to share, he gave us existence. And what does he want from us? He wants us to realize that he is love, and therefore we are love. And the way that God would like for us to relate to him is not offering up some magic, sweet, smelling savors, but like in any good family, if you want to show me love, then show love to somebody in the family who really needs that love. I can remember when my little girl was sick with leukemia and people would say, what can we do for you? I remember thinking, you really don't have to do anything for me. But if you could think of anything to lighten her days, if you could think of anything that could bring her a moment of joy, if you'll do it for her, then you're really doing something that is most precious to me. If you will think out what it means that God's desire is to bless us, that is God's real nature, then the way you show love for God is to show love to some of his creatures who have a need for something that you have. And Jesus understood that so well, because he says at the end, when everybody is gathered before the judgment seat, and some are identified as having gotten the point, and he says, come ye blessed of my Father, and inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundations of the earth. I was hungry, and you gave me to eat, thirsty, and you gave me to drink, naked, and you clothed me. Inasmuch as you did it to the least of these, my brothers and sisters, you were doing something for me. That is simply Sinai religion brought to its fullest expression. The best way for you to show love for God is to show love for one of his children who has a particular need of it. Therefore, you find in Amos this returning back to the fresh vision of the God who wants to bless. You don't find one ceremonial stipulation in the 10 words of Moses. There is nothing said about how to do this or that gesture properly. Everything about the Decalogue is relational and not ritualistic. And the prophets, beginning with Amos, had a wonderful way of summarizing what it meant to live out of that point of reference. When Amos says, what does the Lord require of you but to do justly, love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God? To let justice be the goal as you try to work with other people, to be continually grateful for God's mercy and therefore willing to extend God's mercy. I've said here before that the one difference between heaven and hell, given the biblical vision, is the reality of mercy and forgiveness. Heaven is the place where mercy is accepted and extended to others. Hell is the place where mercy is refused and withheld from others. Only one differential, the incredible concept and reality of mercy. To do justice, to do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly, that is, to accept the fact that God is God and we're his creatures. This really is the best gift that you can give to God. Because remember, what he most wants is that you be blessed. And living this way is the way that blessing becomes a reality. So he stands up in the midst of a great ceremonial time and says, there is no future because you have forgotten the spring out of which you were drawn, the rock from which you were hewn. You have forgotten that God is the one that wants to bless, and that loving others is the way to love Him. As I said, nothing happened as a result of those words that were spoken so courageously. In fact, if anything, the city was even more rigidified in its way of life because the people were greatly offended by his negative prophecy, his condemnation of them. And so there is no record that any of the people that heard him initially made any kind of response to change their lives. It was only 25 years later when that external threat that he had talked about did materialize, and the brutal Assyrians from up in the north came and besieged these cities. It was only then when they fell like a house of cards. The rich were incapable of defending themselves. The poor had no reason to defend the culture. It simply collapsed in the face of this ongoing force. And you've heard the 10 lost tribes of Israel. That's what happened to them. They were simply swept away into captivity, and their identity was largely lost. And it was only after this happened, and they began to say, well, how could God have let this happen to us? Isn't there something wrong with God? Didn't He promise that we would be His chosen people? Then Peter said, but wait a minute, you remember that shepherd that came in from nowhere and said all those harsh things? His suggestion was that maybe our problem is not that God is unfaithful, but that we have never really gotten His point and begun to put this into practice in our lives. And so the writings of Amos helped the people understand that the difficulty was not in divine unfaithfulness, but it rather was in the human lack of understanding of what a God who wants to bless is really like and what it means to live in loving relationship to Him. Part of the blame for what happened or didn't happen in Bethel is because the people were so defensive and so into their self-serving and so beaten down by their exploitation that they simply didn't have the ears or the courage to respond. But I want to close tonight by simply suggesting that though that may have been the reason that nothing at the time came of Amos's effort, I want us to also notice that maybe one of the reasons that Amos was not more effective was that his truth was absolutely impeccable. His insight into what was wrong was right to the point. But the way he related to the people to whom he gave this message was so loveless in itself that it could have been that it made the people more defensive than open to be helped by what he said. What I'd like to suggest is that if you and I are going to have any significant impact on people who are mired down in great problems, that could be our children, that could be our spouses, that could be members of our family or members of the community. If you and I sense that another person is really sick unto death with some kind of real human failure, it makes all the difference in the world. Analysis. But there was something about that condemning spirit that activated the fear in those people rather than the desire to change, and therefore they did not heed him when he first spoke these words, because they didn't sense that what happened to them really made a difference to him. The same thing he had seen in them that was the great problem, sadly enough, in a different form, was also in the heart of Amos. Contrast Amos's way of dealing with the sick situation with another son of Abraham who came many centuries later. This one's name was Jesus of Nazareth. He came into a world where people were just as sick, had just as much wrong with them, were doing life as destructively as anybody was doing it in Samaria. And yet Jesus came, and he first of all gave the gift of love and acceptance. He became known as the friend of sinners and not the critic of sinners. He became as known as somebody who would sit down at table with you and let you tell your story. And there was something about the way he looked at you that made you feel not only does this person know what he's talking about, but this person honestly cares about me. Write it down. It applies to every situation. People do not confess to their critics. Every one of us is so frightened on the inside that if you come at me with a harsh criticism, I'm going to get my fears activated and I'm going to try to keep you out because I don't feel you care about me. You see, if I've got some serious problem, let's say I need to be operated on by a surgeon, the two things I want to know before I let myself be put under an anesthetic and become totally helpless in the hands of this doctor. First of all, I want to know, is he competent? Does he know what he's doing? I had a friend in Kentucky that says somebody asked him once, would you rather have a first-rate surgeon who doesn't pray or a second-rate surgeon who does pray? And the man said, well, I'll take the first-rate surgeon and I'll do my own praying. Well, now, the better answer would be a person who is competent and who also prays, or in this case, a person who, A, I feel like knows what he's doing, and B, cares about my welfare. If I think he's going to turn me into some kind of guinea pig and just experiment on me when he gets me under the anesthetic, I'm not about to let him have access to my insides. Jesus came across as competent and as caring. He came across as one who knew what he was doing and who cared about what happened to the people he was doing it with. And again, he was able to lure sick people out of their fearfulness and into the process of health because he was the friend of sinners and not the critic of sinners. He was walking through Jericho one day and looked up, and there was one of the most despicable people in the whole town, Zacchaeus. He'd sold out to the Romans. He was collecting taxes for the enemy. Everybody in Jericho despised Zacchaeus for the way he'd sold out his people. And Amos, I'm afraid, would have walked up and said, you sawed-off little so-and-so, you are going to get it, and I'm going to be glad to see it when you do. Jesus walked up and said, Zacchaeus, could I go home for lunch with you today? Could I sit at table with you? I bet that's the first time in decades anybody had said, I want to be with you, or shown him any kind of positive concern. And Zacchaeus comes flying down the tree and goes home, and I can just hear him saying to Mrs. Zacchaeus, guess who's coming to dinner? You're not going to believe it. The rabbi that everybody's talking about, and somehow they sat at table, and Jesus helped him see that what was wrong was something that God wanted to help him put right. That he was not condemned until he got perfect, but his one chance of becoming perfect was to accept the mercy that this blessing God wanted to offer. And after an incredibly loving encounter around table, Zacchaeus comes out and says, I need to make a public announcement. I want to start doing my life differently. I want to stop collecting taxes dishonestly, and I want to take much of the money that I've accumulated and put this at the service of people who know that they need it more than I do. The very thing that would have saved Bethel is what Zacchaeus proposed to do, and it was the friend of sinners, not the critic of sinners, who was the agent of that kind of change. What I want to say to us is that here was a man, Amos, of incredible courage, tremendous insight, a man who saw and said very clearly what was wrong. But what was lacking in Amos was a heart that cared for what happened to these people. He has a right to censure, said William Penn, who has a heart to help. If I sense that you care about me, then maybe I will let you in on my sick places and let you help me set right what I already know is bad wrong. There's not a person among us that really needs somebody else to tell us what's wrong. We know that better than anybody else. What we may not know is that there is a mercy that is bigger than all of our sickness, a goodness that is bigger than our badness, that there is one who wants to bless us and is willing to do it even after we have terribly, terribly sinned. And Jesus somehow reversed the sequence of repentance and forgiveness. For years people have said, okay, if you're in bad shape, you've got to repent, then God will give you some forgiveness as a reward. Jesus came and gave the forgiveness first of all. Came and bestowed it like a gift, like it was birth itself. He gave the gift of forgiveness like birth is given. And repentance is what you do when you know you've been forgiven. It's not what you do in order to earn forgiveness. So, my last word about Amos is that this wonderful image of speaking the truth in love was done halfway by him in a remarkable way. He knew how to speak the truth, but the trouble was he spoke the truth with fire in his eyes instead of tears. I commend to you rather his ancestor Jesus, who stood one day over against one of those same cities that Amos had blazed against, that was just as sick in Jesus' time as it was in Amos' time. And we're told he sat over against Jerusalem and wept. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, how I would have gathered you like a hen gathers her chicks, and you wouldn't let me. When we speak our words about sickness with tears in our eyes and not fire, they have a much, much better chance of speaking home to the heart. So, we're all sick. We all need to learn what Amos has to teach us. But more than that, we need the friend of sinners, the great physician, to take that truth and mix it with mercy and give us hope.